This is a post-event recording of a paper delivered to the 2025 British Sociological Association's Work, Employment and Society Conference held at the University of Manchester. The paper is titled Open Offices All the Way Down, the White-Collar Labor Process and Continuities in Commercial Office Architecture. This paper runs approximately 15 minutes long. In his 1999 article, Space, the Final Frontier, Chris Baldry emphasized the importance of space in our experiences and understandings of work, arguing that the work experience of every worker in every office, factory, warehouse, shop, or bank is intimately affected by the qualities and organization of the physical work environment. Baldry continued that despite such an impact, the built working environment has been excluded from the analysis of work organizations. Noticing such a substantial gap, Baldry called the sociological discipline to action, arguing the working environment as a socially constructed space must be reintegrated into analysis as part of both the objective conditions of the labor process and the subjective mechanisms of control and subordination. 26 years on, however, Baldry's call appears to have gone largely unanswered. Labor economists, historians, and sociologists have, of course, continued to produce interesting and meaningful explorations of labor. But while these works have explored the undertakings within places of work, they not infrequently stop short of exploring the architecture and design of such spaces. Similarly, architects and design and architectural historians have begun in recent years to examine the aesthetics and functions of the spaces of work, particularly the commercial office. These works, however, frequently conceptualize the office as a site for the execution of particular work tasks, spaces for writing lines of code, drafting emails, receiving phone calls, mailing letters, and so forth and so on, but not as sites of labor. As a result, we're left with a body of work which seems to imply or suggest that the built environment of work has little to no impact on the reality of work under capitalism. But, as Baldry has succinctly summarized, and as many of us know very well from our lived experience, the spaces in which we toil have a tremendous impact on how we do work, labor relations within the workplace, and also how we understand and conceptualize capitalism more broadly. I've personally found the intersection of workplace sociology and architecture to be remarkably fruitful, as it's this sort of approach which underpins my very recently accepted dissertation, Where Do You Cry in an Open Plan Office? Commercial Office Architecture in the Labor Process. Its findings from this work, alongside implications for sociology, that I'll be presenting today. This paper makes three core assertions. First, that the history of commercial office architecture should be understood as one of continuity. Second, that the continuous nature of office architecture stems from core operational imperatives of capitalism. And finally, that simultaneous investigation of the space, experience, and theory of work can help us better understand all three. So first, I think it helps to start with what the history of the commercial office is. This history has largely been written by an unholy trinity of architects, architectural historians, and management scholars, and it conforms to a remarkably cohesive narrative. Drawing upon the work of business historian Alfred Chandler, architectural histories of the office locate the genesis of this typology at the turn of the 20th century. A dramatically increased scale and speed of business, these authors suggest, necessitated increased administrative personnel and subsequently spaces in which these new employees could work. In the architectural literature, early 20th century offices are characterized by their conformity to rigid and controlling principles of scientific management, order, hierarchy, supervision, and depersonalization. These principles were realized through design, through the creation of ordered space where employees were seated at identical desks, positioned in straight lines, and situated in wide open, unpartitioned spaces. The architectural literature suggests that controlling dictatorial office spaces continued until the middle of the 20th century, when new technologies and materials allowed offices to become wider, deeper, less regimented, and more modern. Grounded in revised managerial approaches like Douglas McGregor's theory Y, mid-century office spaces, according to the narrative, sought to facilitate and encourage individual initiative and empowerment through the implementation of a softer and more hands-off managerial approach. The post-war office made real these ideas by incorporating the comforts of home into the workplace, by adding soft upholstered furniture, bright colors, living plants, and gentler, more appropriate task lighting. In the 1990s, spaces like Gaetano Pesce's New York headquarters for ad agency Chiat Day took the colors and textures of the mid-century office to the next postmodern level, resulting in spaces which were no longer easily identifiable as office spaces at all. The image you see on the screen is not a lounge area of the Chiat Day office, it is part of the actual office itself. The popularization of the laptop computer and cellular phone meant that within spaces such as the Chiat Day headquarters, anything could and should become a workstation. Workers were expected to move around the space throughout the day to different stations according to the task or tasks at hand. Finally, the architectural historiography argues the office has reached its peak with cavernous and uninterrupted floor plans of contemporary office spaces, designed to facilitate the interaction and teamwork necessary for knowledge workers to properly execute increasingly complicated work tasks. Beyond design for work itself, the literature emphasizes the many amenities of contemporary offices and the comfort and convenience that features such as personal chefs, laundry services, smoothie bars, and games rooms provide for workers. In whole, this architectural historiography presents the history of the office as a history of positive change and evolution, of the space of the office getting better with each subsequent iteration and with time. And on the surface, this narrative pitching the evolution of office spaces from regimented prescriptive hellholes to friendly, comfortable spaces based around worker agency seems compelling. However, as my thesis argues, if one actually looks at the procession of office spaces from the last 120 years, we find not a history of positive evolution, but one of continuity, a history of one design, the open office, being repackaged and repeated throughout the last 100+ years. Office spaces from the 1904 Larkin Administration Building to the 1961 One Chase Manhattan Plaza and 2015 MPK 20 site are all comprised of wide open, largely unpartitioned spaces punctuated by orderly clusters of workers sitting at identical desks using identical technologies or machinery. We're left then with a conundrum, with a history of the commercial office which would seem to diverge from the written history of these spaces. Using labor process theory, particularly Harry Braverman's seminal 1974 Labor and Monopoly Capital, my thesis probes this divide, seeking to establish why the space of the office has persisted and why it has persisted in the forms and ways in which it has. In the thesis, I argue that labor process theory suggests to us that the overall configuration of the office has remained relatively static because the labor process under capitalism has remained relatively static. While there have, of course, been changes to the white-collar labor process over the past 100 years, as authors such as David Knights, Hugh Willmott, Paul Thompson, and Chris Smith, among many others, have documented and discussed, the core processes of work under capitalism have remained a constant. From 1904 to 2024, capital has retained a foundational need to valorize and extract labor value from workers, and as a result, a need to control the labor process. As Braverman suggests, in the era of monopoly capital, Capital, acting through management, its agents on the shop floor, must control the labor process itself, the way work is actually done, in order to ensure that sufficient production and through it profit is achieved. There are many ways, as we all know, that this can occur. Most obviously, control can be implemented through things like corporate policies, wage increases or decreases, potential benefits, and the design and management of interpersonal relationships. However, as Baldry suggests, the architecture and space of work can also serve as a meaningful measure to both direct how work should or must be undertaken and to ensure that prescribed methods are actually followed. We can see architecture enabling labor process control throughout the history of the commercial office, starting from the beginning in the early 20th century with the replacement of the cavernous, nook and cranny filled roll-top desk with the efficiency desk model. These pared-down designs limited individual worker storage and established physical guide rails forcing those using the desks to work sequentially and to ensure that no paperwork was left over uncompleted at the end of each business day. The impact of office design and architecture on the labor process can also be viewed in the teamification of work. Teamwork and collaboration, two of the key buzzwords in contemporary white-collar operations, are brought to fruition through both managerial and physical means. By grouping workers together in space and by separating newly created teams from each other, as we can see in the image from PK20, management and the architects working for them can shape worker interactions and communications, direct conversation towards particular task-related topics, and perhaps even frame possible work outputs. And of course, the location of workers in the open plan, with desktops and screens visible to coworkers and managerial staff alike, has and continues to be used as an instrument for managerial oversight, a spatial tool to allow managers to observe and, if necessary, correct working processes as they unfold. Architecture serving as a vector for managerial observation and control explains why workspaces, whether blue or white collar, small or large, seem to share the same overarching layout, a large, relatively unpartitioned open room. This open design allows management to observe and direct employees while also serving as a physical enactment of managerial control over the labor process and a continual reminder of this control to the employees being surveilled. And if I've presented a convincing case over the past 13 minutes or so on the connections between office architecture and the labor process, you may now be wondering why this might matter to you. For architectural historians and architects, integration of labor sociology and architectural history can help to provide more meaningful, deeper explanations of why office architecture looks and functions the way it does. It begins to offer helpful interpretations of why over a century of well-meaning architectural interventions have so miserably failed to meaningfully alter the design of office spaces. It suggests to us that the problems with physical spaces of work don't stem from design or architecture in and of itself, they stem from capitalism. Likewise, looking concurrently at architecture and work holds promise for sociologists, labor scholars, and labor historians. The built environment of the workplace provides visible, physical, easy to understand representations of the processes of labor under capitalism. Through the design and architecture of the workplace, we can see, with our own eyes, the frequently complicated conceptual processes, trajectories, and relationships of labor. The architectural record can, for example, help explain how labor process control and exploitation have, and again continue to be, disguised within the workplace. I've read quite a bit about how provision of amenities within the workplace serves to meet these ends, but far less so about how things like color and form have been used to wallpaper over exploitation. How things like brightly colored locker doors, floor-to-ceiling neon wraps, slouchy beanbags, laptop checkout stations in the form of glistening ruby red lips all differentiate the workplaces in which they're situated from the wider, more bland world of work. Even exterior architecture has been used towards these ends. The so-called poop emoji shape of NBBJ's plan for Amazon's Arlington, Virginia site, and the UFO of Norman Foster's 2017 Apple Park set these structures apart from other commercial office facilities. Wild, wacky architecture and colorful, non-traditional design features combine to silently suggest that what is being done in these places is not work, that the individuals doing things in these spaces are not really workers, and that, as a result, they are not truly being exploited. Such elements contribute to the appearance of the contemporary office as a friendly, human, different, not really work workspace. But of course, as we know, appearance here is a weighted word, since this sort of aesthetic change does little to meaningfully modify the experience or labor relations and power dynamics of work. To summarize the last 16 minutes as this talk rapidly runs down, the built environment of work reflects, enacts, and makes physical the otherwise largely incorporeal processes of labor and management. Architecture and design are among the first and most guttural ways we experience and understand work, and by highlighting and analyzing these realities, we can both better understand work itself and begin to illustrate and communicate these realities to workers, a first necessary step towards changing the world of work and making work better. Space may, as Baldry suggested over 2 decades ago, be the final frontier, but it certainly does not have to stay that way.